When I was younger, every year for Christmas I would drive upstate to my aunt's house along a stretch of highway. I cannot for the life of me remember the name of this road. All I know is that it runs near Akron, New York at some point. However, most of the drive is through rural areas with little to no towns nearby. It was the dead of night, and my groggy self had just gotten off a long shift and had to drag myself to my aunt's house since my extended family was expecting me the following morning. Near halfway through the drive, I realized I was low on gas, which irritated me. My brother told me he had filled it up the day before, so he either forgot or was lying. I saw an archaic-looking sign for a gas station off the next road. It wasn't an official road sign, just literally a pole with a slab of metal attached with the words "gas off next exit" or something along those lines painted on. That seemed a little sketchy, but people do the same thing with fruit stands on highways, so whatever. I pulled off the next exit onto some dilapidated country road through dense woods. The whole thing was creepy and surreal. I kept expecting Leatherface to come running out of the trees with a chainsaw. Anyway, eventually I came to the gas station and quickly realized it hadn't been open for years. It was all rusted and the convenience store's roof was caving in. The gas pumps had all been taken out as well. I pulled over next to it and checked my gauge. I would probably only make it another half mile before running out, so I called AAA and they said they'd send a truck over. Now I played the waiting game. I left my engine on because when the headlights were off, everything was pitch black, and my paranoid self wasn't about to sit next to an abandoned gas station in the middle of a forest in complete darkness. Most of the wait went uneventfully until I sensed movement around the side of the old store, where my lights were pointed. I looked up but didn't see anything more, so I looked back down at my phone. Then, over the sounds of the night, I heard someone yell, "Hey buddy, come here," in a demanding tone. I looked up and I kid you not, there was a dude standing by the old store looking towards me, illuminated by my headlights. He looked like a run-of-the-mill homeless guy. I was honestly spooked and figured he must have been squatting there. Still watching him, I rolled down my window and yelled something like, "Yeah, what's up?" Still mentally freaking out. I had my foot ready to floor it out of there at the first sign of trouble. "You got any change?" "I do not, sorry man." I looked up at him. He had this kind of vacant expression and was standing stiff. Then I saw more movement. There were heads, about 20 or so heads, peeking around trees beyond the man I was talking to. I couldn't see them clearly at all, but they were definitely people. Literally just heads, staring in my direction from around the trees. I saw another guy beginning to walk from around the gas station, and then I turned around and sped off. I got as far away from that place as my tank could carry me and updated AAA on my location. The driver came back over and filled me up, and I didn't say anything. But after he left, I wanted to call the cops, so I called the nearest town sheriff's department. They said they'd send a trooper over and I gave them the location. When I got to my aunt's house, they called me back and said whoever was there was gone, but they could tell a large number of people had been living there for a while. Blankets, canned food, the usual. The whole situation still freaks me out. But frankly, I can consider myself lucky I'll always have such a creepy story to tell. I'm just glad nothing bad happened. And to the creepy dudes at that gas station, let's not meet. This happened when I was about 13 years old, and I still think about it today. My friend Jackie and I were extremely mischievous children. We loved joking around, sometimes using extreme measures to pull the best pranks. I can remember climbing a neighbor's tree with her and devising a rope and pulley system with a basket and water balloons. We'd use it to get the balloons to the top of the tree, so we could throw them at the neighborhood boys without being detected or retaliated against. Sometimes we would do mildly dangerous things to get a good rush, but it was never serious, just harmless messing around. One night, Jackie came over for a sleepover. We ate a bunch of candy and talked about boys, and then we got bored. It was around 1 in the morning, and we were hyped up on sugar so we couldn't sleep. One of us mentioned that we wished our other friend Bailey was there to hang out with. That's when I got the most brilliant idea of the evening. The two of us should sneak out of my house, walk over to Bailey's, and then toilet paper her front tree. For those who don't know, toilet papering means throwing toilet paper all over someone's property, usually trees, for fun. It's like when frat boys in college throw toilet paper all over other fraternity houses to show dominance or manliness, or just plain stupidity. That's what I wanted to do. Jackie, of course, thought it was a brilliant idea. We stuffed a bunch of rolls of toilet paper into 2 large purses, put on sneakers, and sneaked downstairs and out my back door. It was a summer night, so it wasn't too cold, which was good because we were wearing tank tops and pajama shorts. The walk to Bailey's house was half through neighborhoods and half along a long stretch of road next to a golf course with a neighborhood at the very end. Bailey's house was a little under a mile away. We began hustling so that we could get there faster and maybe tap on her window and get her to hang out if she wasn't asleep. At first, we were nervous my parents would catch us, but once we felt confident they wouldn't, we began giggling and talking about boys again. Now, I'm sure most people reading this will think we were very stupid, and we were, but you have to understand the context. My hometown was very quiet. Nobody went outside after 8 p.m. It was ranked in the top 5 safest cities in the United States. Nothing bad ever happened there, at least nothing we knew about at that age. We had thankfully never experienced anything that made us afraid of walking alone or at night. So with that in mind, we figured we had nothing to worry about. We chattered on as we left the residential area and entered the golf course stretch. Suddenly, an SUV rolled up, heading the opposite way. I remember it like it happened a few minutes ago instead of years. The SUV was large, red, and had 4 doors. A middle-aged man was driving. He slowed down as he approached us and rolled down his window. "Hey girlies, what are you doing up so late at night?" He had a huge mouth with perfect, straight, white teeth. And he might have been handsome if he hadn't seemed so strange. "Nothing," I said. He raised his eyebrows at that. "Nothing. All by yourselves. Well, that's dangerous." He smiled again, even wider this time. I could feel fear ripple through me for the first time in my life, like a wave. "We're walking to my dad's house," I lied. "He's waiting for us." Silence crept between the car and us. He knew I was lying. He looked at me, then at Jackie. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that maybe he was just a very creepy, nosy neighbor, but there was something deeply wrong about him. He took his time replying, twisting his words around in his mouth, like he was tying a cherry stem into a knot. "That's interesting. You're so young to be allowed out so late wearing that. You better hurry home to him before it's too late." The air felt heavy. The only thing keeping me from bolting was Jackie by my side. I couldn't see her face because I was locking eyes with the smiling man, but I hoped she had heard what I heard too. "You better hurry home before it's too late." Too late at night, or too late for what? I didn't want to know. I was certain that if we somehow were separated, things would go very badly. I thought quickly. He was on the other side of the road. He'd have to cross it to get to us. I tore my eyes from his and risked a glance at Jackie. She wasn't moving either. She was staring at me with wide eyes, like she was waiting for me to do something. So I pretended I knew what to do. "Thank you, sir. Have a good night," I said. I grabbed Jackie's hand and marched down the sidewalk away from him, trying to look confident. His SUV lingered behind us, unmoving. We kept walking, our sweaty hands gripping tightly like it was the only thing keeping us alive. Clack, clack, clack. Our footsteps echoed emptily on the sidewalk. My ears were in overdrive, listening for anything. A car door opening, a man's voice. But I refused to turn around. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing we were afraid. Suddenly, a car engine roared and we heard him peel off down the asphalt. We started running. As we did, we both glanced back. He was driving away in the opposite direction, away from us. Even so, we didn't stop running. Eventually, we reached the edge of the golf course where we could see the sleepy neighborhood in the distance. It was still far, but it symbolized safety, so we slowed down. We walked in tense silence for a while. I looked at Jackie's face and her jaw was clenched. She glanced at me. "That guy," she said. "Yeah," I replied. "What do you think he wanted?" Jackie asked. "You know what he wanted," I replied. "Yeah, I was hoping you would say you knew him." "No." The sound of a car screeching down the road came from behind us. Both of us turned at the same time to see the man in the red SUV, now on our side of the road, driving straight at us. Neither of us moved, paralyzed with fear. He jerked to a stop next to us and started getting out of the car. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted down the sidewalk toward the houses. The smiling man began shouting something at us, but I couldn't catch his words, nor was I about to turn around and find out. The houses were getting closer, but he had climbed back into his SUV and was now following us, yelling through the window. A corner approached, and we heard the SUV stop. Then his car door slammed. He was running after us. "That way!" Jackie screamed. We turned the corner into the neighborhood, but there was nowhere to go. It was 1 a.m, no lights on in any of the houses. We didn't know anyone in this area. By the time someone woke up and opened a door, he would have caught us. But the first house on the street had a low fence. I pointed at it. Without speaking, we both climbed over and tumbled into a stranger's backyard. They had a dog. Luckily, it didn't attack us. Unluckily, it started barking like crazy. We sprinted across the yard and jumped another fence into the neighboring yard, which didn't have a dog. We hid behind a bush near a temporary pool in the back. The barking continued in the yard we'd left. Through a gap in the bush, we could see the wrought iron fence that separated the yards from the street. At first, there was nothing. Then a voice. "I know you're here, girlies." We could hear him walking, but he was out of sight. A gate rustled and the neighbor's dog barked even louder. He was searching the first yard. He said something else, but it was muffled, and we couldn't make it out. Then there was silence. A shadow passed near the fence. It was the neighbor's dog, now loose. It wandered past the yard where we hid. For all we knew, the man might have already found us and was playing with us. So we stayed frozen in place. As the hours crept by and the early morning light began to break, we heard an engine revving. Horrified, we watched as the red SUV drove slowly past, visible through the fence. His face was set, his head turning from side to side, scanning for us. That's when it hit me. He hadn't driven away the first time to leave us alone. He had been giving us a head start. He was hunting us, and he wanted the thrill of a chase. We stayed hidden in that bush until about 6:30 in the morning when daylight fully arrived. Then we ran back to my house, climbed into bed and pretended to sleep. When we got to my room, I realized we still had all the rolls of toilet paper in our bags, the ones we'd stolen from my kitchen for Bailey's prank. Jackie, since we didn't TP Bailey's house, let's TP mine, I suggested. It has a better tree. Besides, my parents will never suspect us because, seriously, who toilet papers their own house? It was true. The maple tree outside my house was magnificent, and my parents wouldn't think to blame us. But truthfully, I wanted to release all the tension from the night and feel like a kid again. I wanted to pretend we hadn't just narrowly escaped being kidnapped in the middle of the night. Yeah, let's do it, Jackie agreed. We went all out, wrapping the tree completely with toilet paper and then spraying it down with the hose to make it extra messy. Satisfied with our work, we snuck back upstairs and collapsed into bed, exhausted. About half an hour later, my mom burst into my room yelling, "Someone toilet papered our house." That was the end of our sleep. My mom was furious, sure that one of my annoying little friends was responsible. Jackie suddenly remembered she had to babysit for her brothers that morning and bolted, leaving me to clean up the mess with my family. We spent hours pulling wet toilet paper from the maple tree. That day I learned 2 important lessons. 1. Don't TP your own house. It's a bad idea for so many obvious reasons. And 2. Never ever walk at night, even with a friend, even for something harmless. You never know who might be out there waiting for an opportunity to hunt. This happened approximately 10 years ago, around 2015 or 2016. At the time, I was living with someone who worked the opposite schedule from me. He worked the graveyard shift and I worked during the day. So when I was getting up to leave for work, he was just coming home. On the weeknights, I was usually home alone. One night I was feeling especially lonely, and my favorite toy unfortunately broke. So I decided to drive downtown to the 24-hour adult store to buy a new one. The town I live in is a mid-sized suburban town filled with mostly residential areas. The main downtown area was essentially a small section on the way to the freeway. My apartment was 10 minutes away. I pulled into the parking lot behind the adult store. The parking lot was dark and had multiple entry points leading to the bars, restaurants, and the store. After parking, I walked toward the entrance of the store, which faced the street. To reach it, I had to walk past the driveway I just used to park. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed a man standing by himself, smoking a cigarette. It was 1 a.m., and it wasn't normal to see only one person standing alone at that time. I assumed he was a patron from one of the bars on the block, taking a cigarette break. As I passed him, he said, "Hi." I quietly responded with a hi but didn't make eye contact with him. After I passed, I noticed him following me. When I say following, I mean he wasn't just walking behind me. He intentionally matched my pace as soon as I passed him. I didn't know this man's intentions, but being alone at that time of night was a recipe for trouble. As I looked down the empty street, I weighed my options. At first, I thought, keep walking so he doesn't know you're going to the adult store. But since it was 1 a.m. and the street was deserted, that felt more dangerous. Then I thought about going into one of the bars, but that would have made it easier for him to approach me. So I decided my best option was to keep going to the store, where it was well lit and there were people who could see me. I went inside and started shopping for what I came for. The man entered the store behind me but stayed near the front, trying not to look like he was following me. He wasn't even pretending to shop. He just sat there waiting. As I shopped, I heard him make a sound, which I ignored. He wasn't getting the message and kept making the sound as I continued shopping. Eventually, I went up to the cashier who seemed completely unaware of what was going on. I quietly asked, "Do you know that man or does he work here?" The cashier asked me to repeat myself and I asked again in a low voice. Not understanding my attempt to be discreet, the cashier responded, "I can't hear you, say it again." By then I felt my cover was blown, so I spoke in a normal tone. I told the cashier that the man had followed me from outside and wouldn't leave me alone. I explained that my car was parked behind the store, and I didn't feel safe going to it. The cashier simply said, "Okay." The cash wrap area was an enclosed counter, keeping a distance between the staff and customers. The cashier walked to the front, where the man was, and told him to leave. He came back and reassured me that he had told the man to go away, but the man didn't leave. He stayed right there. Not wanting him to follow me to my car, I stayed in the store pretending to shop even though I'd already found what I needed. I kept glancing toward the front to check if he was still there. He was. I went back up to the cashier and explained that the man hadn't left. The cashier went up again and said more firmly, "Enough already, leave the store." Meanwhile, I moved to the back of the store to remain out of sight. By the time I circled back to the front, the man was gone. The cashier explained that he had told the man to leave repeatedly. The man claimed he didn't understand English, but the cashier pulled a baton he kept under the counter for protection, held it over his head and asked, "Do you understand this?" That finally convinced the man to leave the store. I made my purchase, but was still worried about walking to my car even though I was parked in one of the first spaces when you enter the lot. The cashier pointed to a small TV behind him that showed 4 angles of CCTV footage. He assured me the man was gone and told me to come back into the store if I saw him again. He also said he would keep an eye on me as I walked to my car. Though I would have felt safer with him walking me to my car, I understood he couldn't leave the store unattended with customers. After making my purchase, I quickly walked to my car. I always keep my keys ready when heading to my car, so I immediately pressed the unlock button on my car remote, got in, placed my bag of purchases on the passenger seat and started the car. Once the car was on, I released the emergency brake, put the car in reverse and, while fastening my seatbelt, glanced at my side view mirror to back out. That's when I saw the same man in the mirror. He was speed walking right toward my driver's side door. I was driving an Accord at the time, and that model automatically locks all the doors when you take the car out of park. As soon as I saw him, I hit the gas and quickly pulled out of my parking space. I moved so fast that it startled him and made him stop dead in his tracks. He was now standing right next to my driver's side door as I continued to pull out. I gave him the most serious, unwavering stare I could manage because I knew most predators rely on their victims' fear. The stare must have worked. As soon as he saw me pulling out while staring at him, he turned his head back toward the driveway entrance and walked back to where he had been standing. He looked defeated. My face, however, was full of relief. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove myself home. I did feel a little shame for going out alone that late. I told my boyfriend about the incident when he came home at 6 a.m. He agreed that going out that late by myself wasn't the smartest idea. I'm no longer with him, but I still live in the same town. However, I no longer leave my home for anything past 9 p.m. While the town I live in isn't the most dangerous, there are enough crimes that it's not considered the safest either. So to the man who decided to follow me at 1 a.m. with sinister intentions, let's never meet. Last November, my brother came to visit us from Dundee with his 3-year-old son. Since my brother had moved from Glasgow, we didn't get to see him or his family too often, so we really cherished the times we did get together. Unfortunately, his wife couldn't travel down due to work, and only a day into his visit, he was called back to Dundee for an emergency. His son wanted to stay since we had bought him tickets to the football match the next day, so I agreed to take him back to Dundee after the game. The only train I could get was a fairly late one, and it was the last train of the day. So I took my nephew to the football match and then headed straight to the station afterward. The train was fairly busy, but I had booked us 2 seats. Just as we were about to board, the man standing next to me made an odd comment. "Like sardines, aren't they? I hate sardines," he said. I found this a bit strange, but I just laughed it off awkwardly. I've never been good at making conversation with strangers and always feel uneasy when one approaches me. As we made our way to our seats, I noticed an older couple sitting in them. I told them that these were our seats, but they were rude and said that old people shouldn't be made to stand for a journey. I really dislike confrontation, especially in public, so I just let it go. There were no other 2 seats together on the train, so my nephew and I had to stand for about an hour until many passengers got off when the train stopped in Perth. My nephew and I finally sat down, and I was so tired after a long day and standing for an hour that I accidentally fell asleep. Since my nephew was only 3, he also fell asleep. I woke up just as the last passengers were getting off at Dundee. I quickly jumped up and tried to get my nephew off the train as fast as I could, but he was too slow, and we missed the stop. Since the train was slightly delayed, it was now going straight to Aberdeen, which was about another hour away. I sat down and tried to call anyone I knew, but I had no signal. I started to panic as I realized there wouldn't be any return trains from Aberdeen at this time of night, which likely meant I would have to stay the night at a hotel. I tried to compose myself and looked around the train to see if anyone could help me. By this point, my carriage had mostly emptied, and there were only 3 other people left: an older woman sleeping a few rows ahead of me, a young man reading a book on the opposite side, and a 3rd man sitting behind me. I told my nephew to go back to sleep and started trying to plan what I would do once we got to Aberdeen. Since my phone had no signal, it was difficult, and I thought I should ask the man behind me for help. I looked at his reflection in the window and noticed it was the same man who had made the sardine comment earlier. He was a middle-aged man, fairly average in build and height, and there was nothing to suggest he was dangerous, except for one thing. He was staring right at me. I looked away for a moment, thinking maybe he was just looking around the train as I had, but when I looked again, he was still staring. His stare didn't break until he got up, presumably to go to the toilet. I debated switching to another carriage, but before I could gather my things and wake my nephew, he returned and sat in a different seat, facing me directly. A few uneasy minutes passed before he made his first comment. "Someone's sleepy," he said, nodding toward my nephew. I laughed awkwardly and put my earphones in to avoid talking to him, even though my phone had just died. "Must be some set of earphones if they can listen to music when your phone's dead," he said. My heart dropped. "I'm only kidding," he added, but now I had no excuse to avoid conversation with him. "So are you going home or visiting someone?" he asked. I made the mistake of telling him what had happened and that I had missed my stop. "That's quite the situation. You won't get a train back at this time," he said. I nodded and said I'd just find a hotel for the night. He then approached my seat and sat across from me. "Hotels will be all booked out, and even if they aren't, they'll charge you a fortune," he said. "I've got a place not far from the station. You can stay there for the night and get the train in the morning. I'll stay out of the way of you and your son, don't worry." I explained that the child wasn't my son and that I was happy to pay for a hotel. I tried to stay polite, telling him I didn't want to be a nuisance even though I really wanted to tell him to leave. "Oh, believe me, you won't be any nuisance to me," he said in an overly friendly tone. By now, I was feeling extremely unnerved, but still tried my best to talk myself out of the situation. This conversation went on for another 10 minutes, and he became increasingly insistent that I stay with him. I had no idea what to do and felt completely helpless. I told him I needed to use the toilet as an excuse to get away from the carriage. That's when he grabbed my wrist under the table. "You're not going anywhere," he said in a hushed tone. "You're staying with me. I'll keep you safe," he said in an extremely chilling voice. I couldn't even bring myself to scream. The only other passengers on the carriage were at the opposite end, and I was terrified that if I screamed, the man would hurt me or my nephew. He wouldn't let go of my wrist and kept repeating, "Just act natural." The rest of the journey seemed to last a lifetime, and I knew there was no escape, as this man would not let me go. The train finally reached Aberdeen, and the man told me to wake my nephew, not alarm him, and tell him we were staying at this nice man's house for the evening. He held my hand as we got off the train. I felt my worst fears coming true, knowing what would happen when this man got us back to his house. Suddenly, I was knocked to the floor in a heap of bodies. The police had tackled the man and were arresting him. As I got to my feet, I grabbed my nephew's hand and ran a few yards before completely breaking down. The police comforted me and told me that the young man who had been reading his book on the opposite side of the carriage had noticed what was happening and sent a text to the British Transport Police. Their contact number is posted all over the walls of the train. It took me a few minutes to process everything, but I managed to compose myself enough to thank the police and express my gratitude to the man who sent the text. I only managed to say a few words to him, but I will be forever grateful to him, as he saved me from what would have been a night of terror, and very possibly saved both my nephews and my life. The police kindly took me and my nephew back to Dundee, where my brother and his wife were extremely relieved to see us. It has been some time since the incident, but it has had a lasting effect on me. Now, I always make sure to travel with someone when it's late at night, and I never risk missing my stop again. Back when I was 12, I attended a private school, which meant I had to take a long walk to my apartment since the school was a bit far from the city center. This was in Zagreb, Croatia, where I had many public transport options to get home. My usual routine was to get on the bus at the station in front of my school, take it all the way to the main street, then transfer to a tram that took me to a public park. Afterward, I walked the rest of the way home. Our school had a double timetable where 1 week we went to school in the morning, and the next week we had afternoon classes. This happened during one of my afternoon weeks. I was walking out with a few classmates since we all took the same bus to the main street. The rest of my classmates were picked up by their parents. When we got on the bus, there were a few empty seats, so I sat in front of a balding, middle-aged man wearing slightly dirty clothes. That was my mistake. As soon as I sat down, he started staring at me with a cold, unsettling look in his eyes. Feeling uncomfortable, I pulled a book out of my bag and started reading. I would have used my phone, but it was dead because I forgot to charge it before leaving the house. The man didn't stop staring at me throughout the bus ride, to the point where I couldn't even concentrate on my book. I refused to put it down because I was scared. I didn't mention anything to my classmates since we were all sitting in different parts of the bus and I was too scared to move. I didn't want him to see that I was frightened. I think I even convinced myself that he was just staring at me for some silly reason. When we finally reached our stop, my classmates and I got off, and some of us headed to the tram station while the others walked home. The man who had been staring at me also got off and started following us, keeping a fair distance. I told one of my friends about it, but I urged him not to look back, thinking that ignoring this situation was the best choice. When we got to the tram station, my friend and I needed to take tram number 2. We waited for it to arrive and the man was somewhere to our right, but we tried not to acknowledge him. When our tram arrived, my friend and I got on, but so did the creepy man. When I reached my stop, I quietly asked my friend if he should get off with me just in case. But then we saw the man get off first and head into the park, which was in the opposite direction of where I was going. He probably overheard us talking since there weren't many people on the tram at that time. It was around 9 p.m. I didn't think much of it and just assumed it was a misunderstanding. After the tram sped away, I started walking home. The walk was short and would have taken about 5 minutes, but then I noticed someone following me. I immediately knew it was the same man again, so I picked up my pace and headed for my apartment. As I turned a corner into the alley where my apartment building was, the man was getting closer. I buzzed my mom on the intercom hoping she would hurry up, but in the end, the man caught up with me. I could smell the stench coming off him as he started talking. "Hey, how have you been, buddy? I saw your dad yesterday, and he told me all about how you've been getting on at that new school of yours," he said. I immediately knew he was lying because my dad had been away on business for months and hadn't returned during that time. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there staring at him. Just then the door buzzed and unlocked and I bolted inside. I rushed up the stairs, but he was right behind me running as well. I've never experienced such an adrenaline rush in my life as I ran up the stairs to the 3rd floor, especially since I had a backpack full of books weighing me down. But I managed to reach our door where my mom was happily waiting for me. Without warning, I shoved her away from the door and rushed inside, slamming it shut. Fortunately, the man had enough sense not to keep chasing me. I told my mom what had happened and she called the police. They arrived sometime later, asking me about the man's appearance and what had occurred. They reviewed the camera footage, but it was too dark outside, and since I hadn't turned on the indoor lights, they couldn't get a clear view of his face. For 2 weeks, I was too scared to go home alone, so my mom picked me up every time. 2 weeks later, I heard on the news that a man had been arrested for attempted kidnapping of children. The face that they showed on TV was the exact one I had seen that night. I finally breathed a sigh of relief, knowing I was safe for now, but it didn't excuse the fact that I had been careless by not charging my phone, and it reminded me that there are still many bad people out there. Everyone, please stay safe. To the person I met, if you ever get released for some reason, I hope I never see your face again. This week has been hectic. My 3 kids all came down with the flu. My oldest was the first to get sick, and then my younger 2 caught it. After a visit to the clinic, I was heading to the CVS down the street from our house to pick up their prescriptions. Last minute, I decided to drop my kids off at home with their dad so they could rest while I went into the store to grab some Pedialyte. I consider our neighborhood to be safe. I've taken walks after dark without feeling afraid. Most of our neighbors are older folks who have lived here for over a decade. When I pulled up to the CVS, I parked on the side of the building parallel to our street. It's a bit darker on that side, but the entrance is just around the corner and well lit. There was a man standing outside. He walked in front of my car and I could hear him talking, but my music was loud, so I figured he was just on his phone. No real red flags yet. My husband called me as the man walked back toward the corner near the entrance. I got out of my car, still on the phone with him, telling him about the kids and their flu. In a very pleasant voice, the man said, "Hey, I got a question for you. You know where Main Street is?" I assumed he was asking for directions, so I told him I did. I was still holding my phone to my ear in a bright pink case, so I'm sure he saw it. Now he was standing directly in front of me. There was a pillar and a trash can behind him, and around the corner was a propane cage and a red box against the store's wall. Getting past him would have meant getting within arm's reach. He then asked for a ride to a homeless shelter. It was very cold outside and he didn't want to freeze. I empathized with him but told him I couldn't give him a ride. I offered to buy him gloves or a blanket, or I could ask an employee inside to help him find a ride. That's when his face instantly changed from calm to pure rage, before he switched back to being pleasant again. Well, you know what happens to homeless people stuck outside. "You're going to help me, it's right down the street." His voice was now more insistent, and I was unsure what to do. My husband, still on the phone, asked what was going on. I gently told the man that I didn't feel comfortable giving him a ride, that I had the flu, I didn't, and that my husband was on the phone with me. I don't care about the flu. He was now getting angrier and wasn't moving away from the route into the store. I didn't want to turn my back on him and walk back to my car, which was a few feet away in the dark. While he was glaring at me, I decided to quickly walk past him. I pulled out the mask I had from the clinic and held it in front of me as I moved toward the trash can. He looked disgusted but kept insisting I give him a ride. "It's right down the street," he said. But I knew the area, and it wasn't as close as he made it sound. His words were guilt-tripping and threatening, though he didn't actually make any direct threats. Once I made it around the corner, I rushed into the store and straight to the pharmacy. My husband said he was calling the police, having heard the way the man was talking to me. He told me to stay inside. My knees were shaking. I'm not usually the type to feel afraid when confronted. When I reached the pharmacy, I interrupted the pharmacist and a customer, apologizing, then told them what happened. The pharmacist sent the store manager out, a tall guy with a long beard who looked like he didn't take crap from anyone. The police had already arrived. They told the man to leave, which he did, but only momentarily. He returned shortly afterward, yelling obscenities and something about me. The store manager firmly told him to leave and said he was trespassing. The police came back to talk to me and mentioned that they had arrested him multiple times before. He liked to yell at people but wasn't violent. The pharmacist kept me hidden behind the vaccine counter, leaving the half door to the pharmacy slightly open in case I needed to get out. The police officer even told me the man's full name, as did the store manager. I wasn't sure if that was normal, but it was reassuring. Eventually, my prescriptions were filled and I left the store. The police parked next to my car to keep an eye on me. Oh, and the man refused a ride from the cop to the shelter. Later, I looked him up. His name was unique, so it was easy to find him online. No surprise, he had a long record spanning 3 states and several counties, including public intoxication, DWI, urinating in public, assault, battery, and indecent exposure. I also looked up the homeless shelter, and as I suspected, there wasn't one where he said. That area is known for being sketchy. Earlier today, I went to the corner store across from the CVS and told my friend who works the overnight shift what happened. She told me she kicks him out of the store and calls the police every time she sees him. He yells at and threatens customers, but he always leaves before the police arrive. I know I could have handled that situation better. I was blindsided by his sudden shift from pleasant to full of rage. A huge thank you to the pharmacy team who kept me safe, and to the store manager for confronting the man. They didn't have to do all that, but I'm so grateful they did. I'm also thankful my husband recognized I was in an unsafe situation, even over the phone. This man is still out there somewhere in my area. I moved back home about a year ago. My mom lives in a trailer park in a quiet area. I've never had any problems with the neighbors. Everyone minds their own business, and I do the same. However, my mom's fiance is a bit of a social butterfly and makes it his mission to get to know everyone coming and going around the block. Earlier this year, a new guy named Chris moved in next door with what we thought was just a single mom and her child. I assumed he was probably her new boyfriend. Of course, my mom's fiance immediately starts getting to know the newbie of the neighborhood, but over time, things started to get weird. Whenever my sister would go outside, she'd notice Chris flying out the back door to do random things. She also caught him watching out the window quite often, but we didn't think much of it, as sometimes my sister can be dramatic. My mom's fiance even let him use our water and hose to water his garden. I never understood why, but when we got the water bill back at over $200, he told Chris that he couldn't continue using it. Chris immediately got aggressive and tried to claim that we were using too much water, but we'd never had a bill that high before. Last week, I got a random friend request from Chris. I thought little of it and accepted it. My mom's fiance mentioned that Chris had commented on how pretty I was and had asked for my Facebook info, but he acted like he didn't know if I had one. That's when I realized he went through hundreds of my mom's fiance's friends to find my profile. By this point, we'd been chatting on Facebook, and it had been friendly, so I didn't think much of it. Plus, my profile clearly states that I'm in a relationship. I mentioned to Chris what my mom's fiance had said, and he replied that he wasn't going to sugarcoat things, that he actually called me sexy as hell. I told him I had a boyfriend and he apologized, but that wasn't the last time he made a comment or a pass. It was like he completely disregarded that I was with someone. He even asked me to go in the woods with him, meet him outside at night, and just generally made me feel uncomfortable. At this point, I was over talking to him, but one crucial piece of information my mom's fiance had left out was that Chris had just gotten out of prison months ago for some serious crimes. Breaking and entering, arson, and most disturbingly manslaughter for shanking a man while serving time. He claimed it was in self-defense. I have no idea how he was even walking free, but that's beside the point. Usually when a guy doesn't take the hint of, I have a boyfriend, I'd tell them to screw off, block them, and move on. But my mom didn't think that was the best course of action. I even suggested ghosting him, but she worried he might confront me if he saw me out and about, especially since he'd already been caught walking through our yard trying to find me. Her theory wasn't far-fetched. My family and boyfriend were terrified for me. My mom told me I was no longer allowed to go outside by myself, and I'm just trying to save up enough money to move away from here. Edit and update. Thank you to everyone who took the time to read and reply. Last night, my family, boyfriend, and I were outside talking on the front porch when we heard yelling next door. The creepy neighbor sped off in a truck, but moments later he came back and we heard a woman screaming, "Keep your hands off of me." The police were called and more people showed up at the house. My mom, boyfriend, and I decided to go to town. As we were driving, we saw a person on the side of the road, and as we got closer, we realized it was Chris, clutching his phone and looking up the road. Today, I found out that Chris had lied about being single. He was actually cheating on the mother of his children. This poor woman had done everything for him, only for him to try to cheat with 16 other women. As it turns out, she kicked him to the curb. He's no longer living next door. As for the commotion we heard, I'm guessing he tried to take off in one of the cars she owned after she confronted him about his dirty messages. She probably made him bring it back, which led to a fight. It seems he knew someone would call the cops, and given his criminal record, he didn't want to go back to jail, which is why we saw him at the end of the street, looking scared in the dark. I'm sorry for the woman next door for everything she had to deal with. She didn't deserve any of it. As for the creepy neighbor, good riddance. I hope he gets what's coming to him. For the longest time, there was this man who would sit in his garage and watch me. He was an older man, very scrawny, with patchy gray hair and a disgusting beard. I never learned his name, so let's just call him Nick. He looked like a Nick to me. I moved into my classic suburban home before I was even born. I've been living here my whole life, and my first memory of Nick is when I was 10. I remember him giving me a small 2-finger wave as I walked back home after school. I had to pass by his house every day since my bus stop was just a few houses down, and I walked a block to get home. My mom said Nick showed up after I was born, knocking on the door in the middle of the day and ringing the bell until someone answered. My mom finally answered, holding my 1-year-old brother and me in her arms. She said his face lit up when he saw me. He smiled brightly and asked if he could hold me. She obviously denied him because who the hell shows up at your house to hold your child when you don't even know them? She said he scowled at her but calmly walked back to his garage to smoke a cigar. After my first encounter with Nick, I never stopped seeing him. Every day after school, every morning before school, every time I took my dogs out for a walk. Even when I peeked out the window at 3 a.m., I swear this guy never slept. I told my brother how much it freaked me out, but he said Nick was probably on house arrest and that was the only way he could get out. We learned that wasn't true when he knocked on our door. A bit of background. My mom is very weak. She has an autoimmune disease that causes her legs and feet to randomly go numb. She's doing a lot better now, but at the time it was pretty bad. She insisted on taking the dogs out alone one day and I didn't argue. A minute later, I hear a knock. Thinking it's my mom, I yell out that the door is unlocked. But there's another knock, louder this time. I get up to answer the door and there he is, Nick, smiling at me. Hey hun, your mom fell off the porch. You might want to help her, Nick says in this unreal raspy voice that sounds like he's choking. He leaves quickly and I rush to help my mom, calling my younger brother to get the dogs inside. My mom was a bit embarrassed, but was okay, just bruised. She had tripped over a pot while chasing my excited pit bull who pulled her off the porch. Flash forward to my 13th birthday. My mom was in the hospital, so my dad went all out, letting me invite a ton of friends for a sleepover. After some fun, we walked to a nearby park, and the night before we were laughing about the creepy guy next door. I know, not nice, but he was creepy. I told my friends to ignore him if he talked to them, but I didn't take my own advice. Hey Rosie, Nick said quietly, barely audible. My name is Rose, and Rosie is a nickname my grandfather often used, but I never told this man my name. Neither did any of my family members. Hi, I replied, my friend scowling at me knowing I messed up. How's your mom? He asked. She's fine, I said, trying to leave, but I stopped. How do you know my name? You told me, remember? He replied. No, I didn't remember, but I agreed to keep the conversation short. "Oh, right," I chuckled awkwardly. We quickly walked away to the park. The next day, there was a box of chocolates on the porch with a note addressed to Rosie in his chicken scratch handwriting. I looked at him as he waved, and I saw his left hand was in his pants. Grossed out, I left the chocolates on the porch and told my dad. The next morning, my dad and I took the dogs out, but Nick was nowhere to be found. I figured he'd given up after I rejected his chocolates. A few weeks later, a new family moved into Nick's house. I never saw him around anymore. I was 15 now when a woman from the house next door came over. "Does a Rosie live here?" she asked. My heart dropped when I heard the nickname. "Yeah, why?" I answered, trying to stay calm. She handed me an envelope with my full name written on it. "The guy who lived here before us said to give this to Rosie on her birthday." "It's not Rosie's birthday," I said, trying to pretend I wasn't Rosie. "Oh, well, I just took a guess he didn't give us a date. Have a good day." Inside the note simply said, "Love you" in his handwriting, scribbled in red ink, my favorite color. "So, old guy from the corner, let's not meet again. I don't love you, never have, never will." A few years ago, I, a 35-year-old male, had a terrifying experience that still haunts me today. I was living in a busy city at the time and had just finished a late shift at work. It was around 10 p.m., and I was walking home through the quieter side streets of my neighborhood. I've always been cautious, so I kept my guard up, staying alert and scanning for any unusual activity. As I walked down the street, I noticed a guy about 20 feet behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. He seemed like just another person walking the same route, but something about his movements caught my attention. He wasn't walking in a normal manner. It was clear he was trying to keep his distance, but his pace matched mine, no matter how fast or slow I went. After a few blocks, I decided to take a detour. I turned onto a side street that was a little less populated, hoping he wouldn't follow. I checked over my shoulder, and sure enough, he was still there. It's hard to describe, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts told me something wasn't right. I crossed the street hoping that would throw him off, but he crossed too without hesitation. That's when I thought, okay, this is weird now. I had to make a decision. I wasn't far from home, but something about his persistence made me uncomfortable. I decided to stop at a nearby 24/7 convenience store to try to lose him. The store was empty save for the cashier, who barely looked up from their phone. I quickly grabbed a drink and stood by the door, hoping to see if the guy would pass by. He didn't. Instead, he stopped right outside the store. At this point, I could see his face clearly through the glass. He was staring directly at me. I panicked. My heart was racing as I quickly ran down one of the aisles, trying to calm myself down. I could hear his footsteps growing louder as he approached the door. I couldn't stay in the store any longer. I tried to pay, but I was so rattled that I couldn't focus on anything. The cashier just stared at me, probably wondering why I looked so frantic. I tossed the drink on the counter, paid quickly, and bolted out the door. I ran down another street, not daring to look back, but knowing I had to. I didn't see him for a while, and my heart slowly started to calm down. But as I turned the corner to my street, there he was again, standing at the far end of the block. It was like he had been waiting there the whole time. I wasn't sure what to do next. I considered calling the police, but he hadn't done anything illegal. He had just followed me for a while. I didn't want to overreact, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. He was still standing there watching me, and now he was closer. I took a deep breath, checked both ways, and made a beeline for my apartment building, not daring to look back until I was safely inside. When I got to my apartment, I locked the door and stayed there, staring out the window for what felt like hours. I didn't see him again after that night, but the whole experience left me unsettled for weeks. I never felt comfortable walking home alone late at night after that, even though I had lived in this city my entire life. I still wonder if I was just being paranoid, but there was something off about the way he followed me. It felt intentional, and it left me with a gut feeling I couldn't shake. If you're reading this, the guy who followed me for hours that night, let's not meet again.